On the afternoon of September the 2nd, 1896, a young man waded into the Miami River just outside Dayton, Ohio, looking for nothing more than relief from the summer heat. What he found instead was a body, caught just beneath the surface, already badly decomposed from days in the water. The coroner who examined her that evening found nothing to suggest violence. No one in the crowd that gathered recognized her. And so, in the practical, unceremonious way small cities handled such things in 1896, the matter was settled quickly. An unidentified woman, presumed to have drowned herself, buried without a name. She would not stay buried. Within days, a police chief who had never laid eyes on the body would insist she had a name, that she had been murdered, and that he already knew who had done it. Proving it in a court of law would take a full trial, 2 more exhumations, a length of scientific and religious testimony that split the city down the middle, and a young man's own letters written in his own hand, on the very night in question, that would end up doing more damage to him than any witness the state could call. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, because after you've heard everything in this story, I suspect you'll still be arguing about the answer. When the woman he loved died, this man told a minister, in a state of what witnesses described as genuine collapse, that she had shot herself in front of him. He never changed that story again, not once, not even at the very end. So I'll ask you plainly, do you think it's possible to tell the same lie under that kind of pressure for over a year without ever slipping? Or do you think sometimes people believe their own account of a thing because the alternative is too much to carry? Hold on to that question. We're going to come back to it. To understand how a quiet Ohio city ended up divided over that question, you have to start with 2 very different childhoods. She had been placed in a children's home as an infant and was taken in by a Dayton couple, Peter and Elizabeth Little, who raised her as their own and gave her their name. The Littles were respectable people, but not wealthy ones, and as soon as Bessie was old enough, she went to work as a domestic servant, which was the ordinary path for an adopted daughter of modest means in the 1890s. By the summer of 1896, she was 23, well regarded by the people who knew her, and entirely unprepared for Albert Frantz. Dayton at the time was a fast-growing Ohio manufacturing city, the kind of place where a factory clerk's family could sit comfortably above a domestic servant's, and everyone in town understood exactly where those lines were drawn, even when 2 young people on opposite sides of them decided not to care. Albert lived nearby with his elderly father and his older sister, who had become his legal guardian after their mother's death. He was 20 years old, working as a collector and stenographer at a Dayton factory, a position that required real intelligence and discipline, and one he apparently performed well even in the months after the events we're about to describe. About a year before Bessie's death, Albert sought an introduction to her. He became her suitor, and within months, the 2 of them were engaged to be married. They also, in the language of the era's court records, became improperly intimate, a fact that would matter a great deal to what came next. On July the 17th, 1896, Bessie's adoptive mother walked into the family stable and found the 2 of them together under circumstances she considered compromising. That same night, she caught Albert trying to reach Bessie's bedroom, which had, tellingly, been moved to an upstairs room that very day. Mrs. Little gave her daughter an ultimatum: give up Albert Frantz or leave the house. Bessie left. She came back a few days later, stayed about a week, and then departed for good, moving into the Cooper Hotel, a room Albert himself paid for. It's worth pausing here, because what happened at that hotel complicates this story in a way most true crime retellings leave out. Bessie was not simply a heartbroken young woman waiting patiently for a wedding date. She begged Albert to marry her, repeatedly, and he kept putting her off, telling her his father and his sister, his legal guardian, refused to give consent while he remained under 21. At one point he arrived at the hotel in a rage, telling the hotel's bookkeeper that Bessie had sent his father an awful letter and that he was finished with her, before eventually going up to see her and calming down. And during this period, more than once, Bessie spoke openly about ending her own life. She told the hotel bookkeeper she would have thrown herself into the river that very day if she hadn't happened to be riding a streetcar at the time. she wrote a desperate letter to her adoptive mother. And by her own family's later account, she wrote directly to Albert's father, begging him to permit the marriage and warning that if he refused, she would kill herself in a manner, her letter reportedly said, that would be dear to them all. That letter was destroyed by Albert's sister and never survived to be entered as evidence. We only know its contents from the family's own testimony afterward. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it's going to matter enormously later in this story, when a jury is asked to decide whether Bessie Little was the kind of person capable of following through on exactly what she'd been threatening to do for weeks. On August the 20th, Albert moved Bessie out of the Cooper Hotel and into a cheaper boarding house run by a widow, Mrs. Freese. Continuing to pay her rent there, Mrs. Freese would later testify that she heard crying from Bessie's room one evening, and that Bessie told her the next morning it had actually been Albert crying because, Bessie said, she'd told him she wouldn't marry him after all. Whatever was happening between them in those final days, it does not sound like the steady unravelling of a woman calmly planning her own death. It sounds like two exhausted, cornered young people, each one occasionally threatening to walk away from the other. On the evening of August the 27th, around 6 o'clock, Bessie left Mrs. Freese's boarding house, saying she had an engagement with Albert. She never came back. If you're new to this channel, this is exactly the kind of case we build a full documentary around every week's stories that once consumed an entire city's newspapers for months and then all but disappeared from public memory. If you'd like the next one delivered to you the moment it's published, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because what happens over the next few hours of that night is where this case stops looking simple. At around 9:30 that same evening, Albert Frantz arrived at the home of Reverend Tita, a minister of his church and a relative by marriage, in a state witnesses would later describe under oath as genuine hysteria. He threw himself into a chair and, according to Tita's own sworn account, cried out, "My God, what will I do? What will I do? I just want to go to the river and drown myself." When Tita pressed him, Albert said something stranger still, that he wished Bessie had done it on a public street, where someone could have seen her happen upon it, before he fainted outright in the minister's front room. When he came to, Albert told Tita the story he would repeat, without meaningful variation, for the rest of his life. He and Bessie had gone for a drive in his buggy. Crossing a new bridge, she'd asked him to look down the river while she looked upstream to spot a capsized boat that had reportedly been drifting nearby. While his back was turned, he heard a gunshot. His horse spooked. Before he could bring it under control, he heard a second shot. Bessie never spoke or cried out, he said, after that first shot. Once he had the horse settled, he turned back, and in a panic over the arrest and disgrace he believed would follow, he threw her body into the river below, and the revolver in after her. Reverend Tita told him, immediately and forcefully, that he'd made a terrible mistake, that he should have driven straight to the police the moment it happened. Albert collapsed again, into what witnesses called a long faint. When he recovered, Tita suggested sending for Albert's brother, a minister named Albert Frantz, for advice. Albert agreed, but said he couldn't gather his own thoughts enough to write, so Tita dictated the letter himself, and Albert only signed it. The next morning, Albert went to Mrs. Freese's boarding house and acted surprised that Bessie hadn't come home. He insisted on paying a full week's rent for her room in advance, telling Mrs. Freese she must have misunderstood. Surely Bessie hadn't really said she was out with him the night before. It was a small, calculated performance from a man who, 12 hours earlier, had been on the floor of a minister's parlour confessing everything. That evening the 28th Albert's family barn caught fire and burned to the ground, not long after Albert himself had been inside it and had stepped back into the house. His horse was killed in the blaze. His buggy and the coat and vest he'd worn the previous night were destroyed along with it. Neighbours who watched the fire gave conflicting accounts afterward. Some said Albert worked to help put it out. Others said he actively got in the way of anyone trying to save what was inside. That same night, Albert's brother arrived and insisted he see a lawyer. The two of them, along with Reverend Tita, met at the law office of a man named Judge Kreutzer. Albert told the story again. His brother Isaac urged him plainly, whether he was innocent or guilty, he should turn himself in and tell the whole truth. Albert's answer, according to the sworn account, was to ask his own brother how he could think him capable of cruelty toward Bessie, and then he refused, flatly, to go public with any of it. Kreitzer advised the group to simply wait and see what developed. They parted ways. Albert Frantz would not confess to police. He would spend the next several days denying he knew anything at all about where Bessie Little had gone. 6 days after that conversation, her body surfaced in the river. Here is where the story most people know begins to feel almost too clean a straightforward drowning. Quietly buried, nearly forgotten. But it's what happened in the days immediately after that, and one letter Albert wrote that same terrible night before he ever reached Reverend Tita's door that turned this from a quiet tragedy into one of the most talked about trials Montgomery County, Ohio had ever seen. When police first brought Albert to view the recovered body, he looked at her and said flatly that it wasn't Bessie. It took her adoptive parents' identification and then confirmation from her own dentist matching his patient records against her teeth to establish who she was beyond doubt. The coroner's initial ruling stood, death by drowning, self-inflicted. The body was buried a second time. Dayton's police chief, Thomas Farrell, refused to accept it. It's worth pausing on how unusual that was. In 1896, a coroner's ruling was typically the end of the matter for a case with no obvious wound and no grieving family standing at the station demanding otherwise. Farrell had no forensic evidence at this stage, no complaint, and no body he had personally examined. What he had was a set of rumours he'd heard second-hand and a refusal to let the file close. He had heard talk circulating before the body was even found that a young woman named Bessie Little had vanished, and that something had happened to her on a bridge. Word of Albert's collapse at Reverend Tita's house, and the story he'd told there, had leaked out despite everyone's best efforts to keep it quiet, and it reached Farrell's ears before Bessie's own family had even reported her missing. Farrell had the body exhumed. This time, a closer post-mortem examination found what the first one had missed entirely. 2 gunshot wounds, close together, in the flesh near her right ear. The bullets themselves had shattered on impact with bone, but investigators recovered enough lead to confirm they'd come from a .32 caliber revolver, the same caliber, notably, as the gun Albert claimed Bessie had produced from nowhere and used on herself, twice, without him ever seeing it in her hand beforehand. The same examination settled something else that had been circulating as rumour through Dayton for weeks. Some had whispered that Bessie was pregnant, and that this, more than anything, explained both the family's harsh reaction and Albert's reluctance to marry her. The coroner's post-mortem findings said otherwise. She was not pregnant at the time of her death. Whatever fear or shame had driven the events of that summer, it wasn't that. To preserve the physical evidence for what all of Dayton now understood would become a murder trial, the coroner made the decision that would define this case in the public memory for the next century. Bessie's head was severed and kept, preserved as an exhibit. Her body was reburied a third time. Chief Farrell now had a cause of death. He still needed the weapon, and something resembling a motive strong enough to try a 20-year-old stenographer for his life, and both were about to surface within days of each other, in a way that made this case, for a while, the biggest story in the entire region. There was one more piece of testimony that surfaced during the investigation, and it sat uneasily against Albert's own account. Several contemporary newspapers reported that people living near the bridge recalled hearing a woman's voice cry out the word murder that night, followed by 2 gunshots not, as Albert had told Reverend Tita, 2 shots fired in near silence, with no sound from Bessie at all after the first one struck her. If those neighbours heard what they said they heard, the sequence of that night looked very different from the version Albert never changed. On September the 5th, investigators searching the area found a fresh pool of dried blood on the bridge over the Stillwater, along with 2 ornamental combs that Bessie's family and Mrs. Freese both identified as hers, and buggy tyre tracks running close by. When Farrell went to compare those tracks against Albert's own buggy, there was nothing left to compare the fire 2 nights earlier had seen to that. Whether that fire was an accident or something else entirely, Dayton never got the chance to find out, because the one piece of physical evidence that might have settled the question in an afternoon no longer existed. Farrell wanted the revolver more than anything else in this case, and he mounted what amounted to a small expedition to find it. 12 heavy magnets, 3 pounds apiece, dragged behind rowboats across the width of the river, followed by a professional diver and a champion swimmer, both searching the riverbed by hand. The gun was never recovered, but the search for it led Farrell to a Dayton gun shop whose clerk told police, with what the courtroom would later call real confidence, that he'd sold Albert Frantz a .32 caliber self-acting revolver sometime that August, weeks before Bessie disappeared, and at almost exactly the moment his engagement to her was quietly falling apart under the weight of her family's ultimatum. And then came the discovery that turned this from a sad, ambiguous case of a drowned young woman into a genuine scandal. Investigators learned that for months before Bessie's death, Albert Frantz had also been courting another woman, entirely a young woman named Molly Cart, who lived in the countryside outside Dayton. 6 love letters, written by Albert to Miss Cart between March and July of that year, were entered directly into evidence. In the last of them, dated weeks before Bessie's death, he told her he'd call soon to hear her answer, as he put it, as to whether it would be yay or nay on a proposal of marriage. Here is the detail that, more than any other piece of physical evidence in this entire case, would follow Albert Frantz for the rest of his life. On the night Bessie Little died after the shots on the bridge, after disposing of her body and the revolver in the river, after arriving home and speaking briefly with his father and sister, Albert Frantz sat down and wrote Molly Cart a love letter more than 1,000 words long. In it, he quoted scripture. He made playful remarks. He complained, with apparent sincerity, that rumours were circulating about him running with what he called bad company, and asked her to name a time so they could talk it through properly. He closed the letter by noting the hour 9 o'clock at night. It was postmarked the following morning. It was only after sealing that envelope that Albert Frantz walked to Reverend Tita's house and collapsed into the story he would tell, without alteration, for the rest of his life. With a purchased weapon, a hidden second engagement, a burned buggy, and a love letter written within hours of a woman's death, Chief Farrell finally had what Montgomery County's prosecutors considered enough circumstantial evidence to try Albert Frantz for murder in the first degree. But building a case is one thing. Convincing 12 jurors that a self-inflicted double gunshot was medically impossible, while an equally credentialed set of doctors stood ready to argue the opposite was going to be something else entirely. Frantz's trial opened in Dayton in December of 1896, and by the time it concluded, more than 100 witnesses had taken the stand, an extraordinary number for a county courthouse of that era, and a measure of just how completely this case had consumed the city. It didn't stop at the city limits either. Papers as far away as Philadelphia, Cleveland, and across the river in Kentucky ran their own coverage of the Little case, and updates on the trial were reprinted in papers as distant as South Dakota. For a few months in the winter of 1896, a domestic servant from a Dayton children's home and a factory stenographer, half her family's social standing, were between them a genuine national curiosity. Albert had real legal talent behind him. His attorneys included Judge Kreitzer himself, alongside a lawyer named Van Schaik, and the court additionally appointed Robert M. Nevin, widely regarded at the time as one of the most capable criminal defense lawyers in the entire state. Against them stood a prosecution determined to make one image impossible for the jury to forget. They brought Bessie Little's preserved skull directly into the courtroom and pointed to the 2 entry wounds behind her right ear. Daring anyone present to explain how a woman could inflict that wound on herself, then somehow do it again. The defence's answer was medical testimony, and for several days it very nearly worked. Physicians called by Frantz's attorneys testified that it was in fact anatomically possible for a person to fire a second shot into their own head after an initial, non-instantly fatal wound. The prosecution's own doctors disagreed just as confidently, arguing the angle and proximity of the 2 wounds made a second self-inflicted shot essentially impossible. Neither the defence's insanity theory nor the anatomical evidence about the wounds settled the matter cleanly this was, and remained a case decided on circumstance rather than certainty, which is precisely why appeals for mercy would keep coming for Albert Frantz long after the verdict. The defense never formally argued that Albert was insane at the time of the killing, but the prosecution wasn't taking any chances. 6 separate physicians examined him and testified, one after another, that he was entirely sane, closing off that avenue before it could even properly open. The defense also called a long line of character witnesses, former teachers, college professors, pastors, and friends who had known Albert since boyhood, who described him consistently as quiet, well-mannered, and entirely unremarkable in temperament. By every indication, that testimony was sincere. Albert had also gone on reporting to his job as a stenographer and collector in the weeks between Bessie's death and his own arrest, performing his duties competently the entire time, exactly as he always had. To the jury, that composure could be read two different ways: either the ordinary conduct of an innocent man simply going on with his life, or something considerably colder, the discipline of someone who had already settled, in his own mind, precisely which story he intended to tell, before he'd ever needed to tell it out loud. What ultimately turned the jury, by most contemporary accounts, wasn't the dueling doctors at all. It was the accumulation of everything Albert Frantz had done in the 24 hours after Bessie died. The burned barn destroying the one piece of evidence that could have cleared or convicted him outright. The secret second engagement to a woman he'd been actively courting the entire time he claimed to be devoted to Bessie. The 1,000-word love letter written the very night of her death, and a story that had never once needed to change, because it had apparently been ready before he ever walked through Reverend Teeter's door. After 6 days of testimony, the jury convicted Albert Frantz of murder in the first degree, and he was sentenced to die in Ohio's electric chair. That sentence carried more weight than it might at first suggest. Until 1885, executions in Ohio had been carried out by public hanging in whichever county the crime occurred. That year, the state moved all executions to the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus, still by rope. It was only in 1897, the same year Albert Frantz would die, that Ohio switched to the electric chair for the first time, on the theory that electrocution was a more humane method than the gallows. The first man to test that theory, only months before Albert Frantz, was a 17-year-old from Hamilton County. Albert Frantz would become the fourth person in the state's entire history to die in that chair, in a method of execution barely old enough, at that point, to have a track record at all. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. In the months before his execution, Albert's family submitted a formal application asking the state to commute his sentence to life imprisonment, built on two arguments. First, that there remained genuine doubt he had done the killing at all, and second, that if he had, he wasn't mentally responsible for it. In support of that second claim, his father and sister came forward, for the first time, with something they had deliberately withheld during the trial itself, sworn statements describing severe, recurring insanity on Albert's mother's side of the family. Several of her brothers and her twin sister had reportedly been violently insane. A number of cousins had spent time in asylums or taken their own lives. Albert's family admitted, under oath, that they had kept all of this hidden from his own defense attorneys during the trial, purely out of what they called family pride. The Ohio official who reviewed the application, a man named George Ewing, considered all of it carefully and rejected it. He noted that the 6 physicians appointed to examine Albert had found him fully sane. If 2 of them privately considered him what the era's language called a degenerate given his family history. Ewing's own written reasoning, preserved in the state's official records, argued that everything Bessie herself had said and written about wanting to end her life, taken entirely on its own, might well have supported the theory of suicide. But he found it impossible to reconcile that theory with everything Albert Frantz did in the hours and days that followed the burned barn, the letter to Molly Cart written that same night, and a story so complete and unwavering that it seemed, in Ewing's words, to have already been settled in Albert's mind before he ever needed to tell it to another living soul. Even an appeal from a number of ministers of the Dunkard Church, of which Albert was a member, a peaceful, devoutly pacifist Christian denomination opposed to capital punishment on religious grounds, was respectfully considered and ultimately set aside. The commutation was denied. On November the 19th, 1897, at 12:22 in the morning, Albert Frantz was executed in the electric chair at the Ohio Penitentiary, the 4th man in Ohio's history to die by that method, which the state had adopted only that same year in place of the gallows. To the very end, In front of witnesses with every reason to expect a deathbed confession, he told the same story he'd told Reverend Teeter on the night it happened. That Bessie Little had shot herself twice, and that his only crime had been panic. Bessie's own ending carried one final, quiet injustice. And then, finally, a small correction. Because her relationship with her adoptive family had grown so strained in her final weeks, she was at first laid to rest in Potter's Field, the plot Dayton reserved for the unclaimed and the unidentified. The very fate that had briefly been hers already, once, before Chief Farrell ever doubted the coroner's first ruling. It was only after Albert Frantz's execution that her family had her body moved to a proper plot in Dayton's Woodland Cemetery, where she rests today under the name given to her by the parents who raised her. The bridge itself, the one Albert always claimed they were crossing when the shots rang out, was eventually replaced in 1927, more than 30 years after the case that made it infamous. But locally, people still call it the Bessie Little Bridge, and for well over a century, there have been those who say they've seen a woman's figure crossing it after dark, gone before anyone gets a clear look. Whether you believe that or not is entirely your own business. This is a documentary, not a ghost story, but it says something about how deeply this case embedded itself in one city's memory, that people are still telling each other to watch that bridge at night. 130 years later, a case that once ran in newspapers from Philadelphia to South Dakota is, today, barely a footnote outside of Dayton itself. That's true of almost every case we cover on this channel, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. National attention, it turns out, has a shelf life measured in months, not centuries. What stays with you, looking back at this case now, isn't really the doctors, or the skull in the courtroom, or even the 6 days of testimony. It's the letter. A man claims to have just watched, helpless, as the woman he loved shot herself in front of him, and within hours, before he's told a single other living soul, he sits down and writes 1,000 words to somebody else, closing with a request that she set a date to discuss their own engagement. Maybe grief does strange things to people. Maybe panic does. Or maybe, as the state's own reviewing official concluded in 1897, some behaviour simply can't be explained by anything except the truth everyone was afraid to say outright. So here's that question again, the one I asked you back at the start. A jury of 12 men in Dayton, Ohio, heard every piece of this: the burned buggy, the secret second fiancé, the purchased revolver, a story that never once changed because it never needed to, and decided a man was guilty enough to die for it. Ohio's own Board of Pardons heard the appeal, and the family's late confession about inherited insanity, and upheld that same verdict. If you'd been sitting in that jury box in the winter of 1896, would you have voted the same way? Tell me in the comments, and if you want the next forgotten case in your feed the moment it's published, you already know what to do.